Welcome to Understanding Net Zero. I am Jenny Ramos, Head of Content Development at TCLP. This workshop is mostly informational, but does include a quiz, so be prepared to pause your video and access the quiz shortly. This workshop is a prerequisite to part 2 of this workshop series, Applying Net Zero to Contract Clauses, which is a more collaborative workshop that you can sign up to on our website. The aim of this workshop is to build up your practical drafting toolkit to incorporate net zero into commercial contracts. If you haven't been to a TCLP event before or aren't familiar with our climate clauses, please join us at an Introducing Climate Clauses call. They're all listed on our website. They run 3 times a week across multiple time zones. There you can get an overview of the project and our climate contract clauses. The format of this workshop is as follows. An introduction to net zero, followed by a quiz and a video clip of our colleague exploring its nuances. An overview of the tools we provide on our website and how you can take forward your learning from this session. Net zero is a complex concept. There is more than one way to incorporate net zero into contracts, and importantly, every contract will require consideration of the specific context and commercial issues in that particular set of circumstances. Just as every precedent clause requires a lawyer to turn their legal minds to the use of that clause in the particular contract, the concept of net zero also requires us to think critically and acknowledge that these concepts will continue to evolve alongside industry standards for implementing net zero in commercial settings. Our TCLP net zero drafting should be used as a base only and inspiration for you to use and draft your own net zero contracts. But why is it important that we reach net zero by 2050? Parties to the Paris Agreement, that is 196 countries responsible for more than 90% of global emissions, committed to holding the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees C above pre-industrial levels, recognising that this would significantly reduce the risks and impacts of climate change. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that is the UN body for assessing the science related to climate change, in its special report in 2018, and more recently in August 2021 in its 6th assessment report, made clear the vital importance of reaching net zero by 2050. The updated IPCC report makes it clear that every incremental degree of warming matters and confirmed that there is a narrow path to curb warming to just above 1.5 degrees C. Due to the important and urgent nature of limiting the effects of global warming and the imperative of there being no safe level at which the global economy can continue to emit at, many governments, subnational actors, business and communities have committed to net zero targets. 73% of global emissions are now covered by a net zero target. That figure comes from Climate Action Tracker. However, in order to meet net zero, the whole global economy must rapidly transition. Even once the world stops using fossil fuels, carbon dioxide will remain in the atmosphere and keep warming the planet for many years. In order to keep climate change within the 1.5 degrees C warming goal, global net human-caused emissions of carbon dioxide must fall by approximately 45% from 2010 by 2030 to reach net zero around 2050. Before we jump into the detail of net zero and the concepts that underpin it, we will test your knowledge on some of the key concepts with a short multi-choice quiz using Google Forms. Pause the video and follow the link provided with this video's description to complete the quiz. If you have problems accessing the quiz through that link, you can also take it using the worksheet provided with the video. We will go through the answers later in the session. So pause the video now. I hope you enjoyed the quiz. Before we go through the answers, we will play a video of our colleague Ming Zi providing a clear and concise overview of net zero, covering the key aspects that were tested in the quiz. We will then go through the quiz answers.
Hi everyone, I'm Ming Zi, and today I'll be taking you through the basics of net zero and what a net zero target actually is. Although the term is bandied about a lot, net zero is not a monolithic concept. it is important to understand the complexities behind it to be as transparent and clear with our legal drafting as possible. Net zero is the point where there is no net impact on the climate from greenhouse gas emissions. There are two main ways of reaching net zero: reducing emissions and removing emissions. Emissions reductions would include switching to low emissions technology like solar power and improving the energy efficiency of buildings. Removing emissions involves things like carbon sinks, both natural ones like forests and man-made ones like carbon capture and storage technology. Net zero is a concept. This is why you hear it being applied to multiple entities at multiple levels, and this can get confusing at times. Governments, like the UK, take a whole-of-economy view of the net zero transition. Investors and shareholders speak about net zero financial portfolios, so they are assessing the degree to which the companies within their portfolio, in aggregate, have plans to reach net zero. Individual organizations have net zero strategies for their business operations. Net zero is the vocabulary that the international community has rallied behind. It's what the UNFCCC, COP conferences, organizations, and financial institutions are using. But what does it mean to have a net zero target? If you follow the media's coverage of climate finance, it might seem as though everyone under the sun is setting net zero targets. But here's the rub: one person's vision of net zero may vastly differ from another's. The key is to look behind the label of net zero to what the target actually is, how it is calibrated, and what accountability measures are in place. There are shades of light to dark green for net zero targets, and as lawyers, we need to be live to these nuances when we draft. There are 7 key elements of a net zero target, and I'll be taking you through these in turn. Within each element, there is a spectrum of ambition. Different organizations and countries are on different stages of their net zero journeys. At TCLP, the expectation is that, regardless of where you start, that you are climbing up the ladder of ambition. The first element of a net zero target is scope. Carbon emissions are bounded following the Greenhouse Gas Protocol's scoped approach. Scope 1 emissions are direct emissions occurring at source, which the company owns or controls. If you are a logistics company, this might be the fuel and emissions by your heavy vehicles. Scope 2 emissions come from the energy consumed by a company. This would include the energy consumption of a business's office blocks. Scope 3 emissions include indirect emissions from the company's entire value chain, even though some sources are not owned nor controlled by the company. This would include the emissions of all of your suppliers. These figures are taken from Vale, a Brazilian metals and mining company, and as you can see, the majority of its emissions are in Scope 3. The international consensus is that a credible net zero target must include Scope 3 emissions, because if not, how do we ensure a whole-of-economy transition? There are several difficulties with this, including a lack of high-quality Scope 3 data, a lack of control over those emissions, and issues of double counting. A couple of solutions include setting materiality thresholds, such as a threshold to include all of your significant emissions categories so that only a maximum of 5% of overall emissions are omitted. Or you could stipulate that only particular sectors with high Scope 3 exposure have to disclose, like oil and gas and automobile sectors. We need to consider how best to include Scope 3 emissions in our drafting, ensuring that we are reducing and removing as many emission sources as possible. The second element of a net zero target is warming. I like to think of this as the area under the graph, or in terms of cumulative emissions. Recall the definition of net zero. It is the point where there is no net impact on the climate from greenhouse gas emissions. This is a point of time. It says nothing about the emissions that released before we get to net zero. In other words, net zero can be reached at many temperatures. We can reach net zero here, here, and also here. The more we delay, the more emissions will generate in the meantime. But we can also reach net zero in 2050 and far overshoot our target of a 1.5 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures. How? This would happen if we continue to emit at business as usual levels then had a huge realization in 2040 and pushed the throttle on decarbonisation. In such a situation, we'll have emitted this much more greenhouse gas emissions than in the alternative scenario, the yellow line, had we had a staged, steady decarbonisation. All of these extra emissions would overshoot our carbon budget of 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming. To minimise warming, we need to act quickly and effectively. The sooner we can implement climate and net zero aligned clauses in our contracts, the more likely we are to stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. The third element of a net zero target is timing. It is international consensus that 2050 is the year to aim for, but some easy to decarbonise sectors should aim for before this. Moreover, best practice is to build in interim targets in the lead up to the 2050 goal as a measure for accountability. For example, in July 2020, the Supreme Court of Ireland ruled that the Irish government was in breach of its climate change obligation, as its net zero plan did not include any interim targets. Another element to timing is the pace of decarbonisation, or the rate at which we decarbonise. This has attracted debate. The European Commission stipulates that for something to be Paris-aligned, it must entail a minimum 7% year-on-year footprint reduction. However, this 7% is a sector-agnostic figure. Others have argued for more sector and region-specific approaches, and there is a lot of work to do to develop more granular pathways of decarbonisation. Lastly, we should not forget that in order to stay within 1.5 degrees of warming, we are going to have to be negative for a long time after 2050. Most net zero plans don't even look behind this horizon. When drafting, you should take each industry and organisation on a case-by-case basis and draft with ambition in mind for your particular sector. Remember to hold yourself accountable by including interim targets. The fourth element of a net zero target is offsetting. This is, in essence, paying somebody else to do your emissions reductions or removals for you. We might question whether this is a valid strategy at all. Then, there is the secondary question of, if we do use offsets, how do we govern their responsible use? We also need to think about the quality and type of offsets. Are they offsets that reduce emissions, for example, funding a wind farm? Or are they offsets that remove emissions, for example, planting trees? Do they have additionality? But for you paying for this tree, would it have been planted anyway? Are they permanent? In 10 years, will a climate change-induced wildfire burn down the tree you bought via your offset, thereby releasing the carbon sequestered back into the atmosphere? And how do you verify these things? We need to consider whether we want to rely on offsetting at all, but if we do, we need to evaluate the quality of our offsets before including them in our drafting. The fifth element of a net zero target is governance. We want to think about high-level engagement for these targets. Are decisions around climate risks taken at board level, and how is accountability ensured? Setting interim targets will contribute to this. Corporates should also consider reporting and disclosure frameworks like the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, the TCFD, and the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, SASB. The sixth element of a net zero target is a just transition. A net zero transition must be just, both as a matter of principle and in order to get the buy-in of our whole population. Considerations of equity feature in all of the elements I've just discussed. When considering the pace of decarbonisation, might it be slower for regions that are underdeveloped and require more infrastructural investment? Or for industries, offsetting is an international business. Where are your offsets being anchored, and how do they impact the economies and communities locally? The seventh element of a net zero target is climate policy engagement. We should query whether the corporate's lobbying activities, trade association memberships, and public policy positions are Paris-aligned. Higher ambition doesn't necessarily mean better. Sometimes we want to draft in a consciously low barrier to entry in order to encourage people to start their net zero journeys. Other times, we might want to pitch the standard really high to push the boundaries of what industry thinks is possible. The most essential thing is to be transparent with where we are pitching our ambition and why we are pitching it at that level. Lastly, a minority of clauses will not relate to net zero at all. They might instead speak to other elements like biodiversity, environmental protection, or climate change resilience. For instance, a clause around food supply chains and risks from climate change-induced weather events would speak to climate resilience. Reaching net zero emissions is a huge challenge, but everyone has an opportunity to support climate action. In fact, lawyers have a hugely important role to play by introducing net zero concepts into their contract clauses. Thank you so much for listening.
We will now go through the quiz questions and answers to understand why those are the correct answers. Further detailed answers and all resources referred to are contained in the worksheet provided with this video. So, question 1. Can you reach net zero if you do not use offsets? Yes, you can reach net zero without using offsets by reducing all of your emissions to zero. There are two main ways of reaching net zero: reducing emissions and removing emissions. In order to pursue efforts to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, we need to reduce all emissions to zero, leaving only those emissions that are not feasible after all reasonable efforts to reduce and make plans to become net negative, where actions to reduce GHG emissions and remove them from the atmosphere exceed unabated GHG emissions. Question 2. Company A today announces that it has reached net zero. However, it has done so by emitting the same amount of greenhouse gases and using offsets to balance those emissions. Is this high climate ambition? No, it is not high climate ambition. You can reach net zero if you produce GHG emissions by offsetting those emissions. However, there is no safe level at which the global economy can continue to emit GHG emissions. The collective global carbon budget that remains before global temperatures exceed 1.5 degrees C does not allow for everyone to continue producing the same amount of emissions, even if offsetting them. We recommend you read our discussion document on offsets, insets, and carbon credits for the complexities and potential problems of offsetting and carbon removals. You can find that on our website with our net zero implementation tools. Question 3. According to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which scope of emissions includes consideration of greenhouse gas emissions outside of an organisation's control across that organisation's whole value chain, but excluding electricity purchased by the company? Answer: Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 is direct emissions occurring at source, which the company owns or controls. Scope 2 is emissions coming from the energy consumed by a company. Scope 3 is indirect emissions from the company's entire value chain, even though those sources are not owned or controlled by the company. This would include the emissions of suppliers. Question 4. What is the Paris Agreement target for limiting the global temperature increase by 2050? The answer is B, well below 2 degrees C, preferably 1.5 degrees C. Please see the IPCC special report on the impacts of global warming of 1.5 degrees C to understand the implications of these two temperature targets and the differences between them. And also the more recent IPCC report, Climate Change 2021, the Physical Science Basis, to understand the urgent imperative of these targets. Question 5. Which of the options below are part of the 7 key elements of an ambitious net zero plan? And the answer is all of them. Short, medium, and long-term interim targets are critical to an ambitious net zero target and beyond, in order to identify and proceed with the actions towards the immediate decarbonisation that is urgently required, and to be sure of achieving the target by 2050 or ideally before. There is consensus that good climate governance entails formal top-level commitment, transparency, and accountability through regular reporting and tracking and clear plans with specific operational implications. There is also consensus that corporations' lobbying activities, trade association membership, and public policy stances should be Paris-aligned. A company's stance on climate policy, its lobbying activity, overall economic power, and ability to influence public and policy discourse are as significant as its physical carbon footprint when assessing its climate impact. Question 6. Which of the following emissions are included within your Scope 3 emissions? The answer is C. Only GHG emissions from electricity used by your customers would be Scope 3. Those are indirect emissions from the company's entire value chain, even though those sources are not owned or controlled by the company, which would include the emissions of suppliers. GHG emissions associated with oil burnt in boilers used in your manufacturing plant would be Scope 1 emissions. And GHG emissions associated with electricity used by a company renting a floor in your HQ office block where you have procured and paid for such electricity would be Scope 2 emissions. It would be different, however, if the tenant had paid, because then it would fall within your Scope 3 emissions. Question 7. Which of these are residual emissions? The answer is A. The emissions that are left after you've made all reasonable efforts to reduce your GHG emissions. You need to make all reasonable efforts, not just reasonable efforts. The slower the pace of decarbonisation, the more warming is baked in before 2050 in terms of cumulative emissions. If you remember in the video, that is the area under the graph. During a company's transition to net zero, compensation and neutralisation measures, i.e. offsetting, may supplement but not substitute reducing value chain emissions in line with science, which is why it is advisable to follow a mitigation hierarchy, first reducing emissions before offsetting. And this is why the definition of residual emissions is significant. Question 8. Does a just transition allow countries in less developed regions to continue to burn coal? Maybe. The Paris Agreement requires equity and common but differentiated responsibilities in the light of different national circumstances. A net zero transition must be just, both as a matter of principle and in order to get the buy-in of the global population. Decarbonisation pathways might need to be slower for regions that are undeveloped and require more infrastructural investment, or for industries where emissions are hard to abate. But this isn't an automatic rule and depends on circumstances. Principles are yet to be agreed that govern decisions around who should be allowed to decarbonise more slowly and how much weight just transition principles might carry when set against the need for rapid decarbonisation. Question 9. Any credible net zero plan needs to cut carbon emissions each year by at least 7% is the answer. This is the minimum pace required on average globally to halve absolute emissions every 10 years, consistent with reaching net zero by 2050. But this does not take into account whether the sector is hard or easy to decarbonise. So you may see different percentage figures cited. Sectors that are easier to decarbonise should aim for faster emissions reductions to balance out the hard to abate sectors. And according to the recent IPCC report, Climate Change 2021, the physical science basis, which suggests this may not be enough to hold warming to 1.5 degrees C. And finally, question 10. Can we realise a decarbonised and equitable economy through the implementation of net zero only? No. Net zero itself will not realise a fully decarbonised economy. There is complexity in the concept of net zero and much debate about its pros and cons in terms of achieving the goals of the Paris Agreement. Some commentators warn that net zero targets are misleading, insufficiently robust, and lead us to rely too heavily on offsetting, unproven technology, and a diminished sense of urgency. Proponents argue that if the criteria can be strengthened and robust targets set, net zero is necessary to trigger and continue decarbonisation. Furthermore, net zero alone will not realise a decarbonised economy. A net zero transition must be just, both as a matter of principle and in order to get the buy-in of the global population. Furthermore, the climate crisis is inextricably linked to the biodiversity crisis, both driven by human economic activities and mutually reinforcing each other. Loss of biodiversity and nature is deepening the climate crisis and our ability to adapt to it. Neither will be successfully resolved unless both are tackled together. We can appreciate that the concepts around net zero can seem dense when you're not familiar with them. Luckily, we have a number of TCLP resources available to assist with your understanding of net zero. Our net zero implementation tools support you to amend contracts to meet net zero goals, strengthen net zero ambitions to align with the Paris Agreement, accurately define climate terms, and know the key issues to look out for when including net zero commitments in contracts. The toolkit includes a drafting checklist, sample drafting for key concepts, and our net zero dashboard. We will take you through some of those key resources now. The Net Zero Explainer contains an overview of the key concepts of net zero for lawyers who may not be familiar with net zero, and provides a good starting point, covering those 7 key concepts on the left-hand side of the slide. It's a good one to share with colleagues who may be keen to learn about net zero. The dashboard is a simple graphic we have created for an organisation to map itself against. You can determine the level of ambition for your net zero goals and see the goals and targets that would move you across from left to right. The column on the left represents the low ambition or arguably no ambition climate targets. For example, you only look at Scope 1 emissions. You're on target for a temperature rise above 2 degrees C. You have no board oversight or even capability in this area, and you are actively funding lobbying which is anti-climate. The column on the right is all the metrics which align with high ambition targets in line with the Paris Agreement. You can see where an organisation sits in relation to these 7 key areas, and this gives you the targets to help you level up your contracts along a pathway to net zero. Our clauses span the entire pathway from low ambition or light green, for example, Eddie's recital, which may affect contract interpretation but is not a legal obligation, all the way through to a high ambition dark green clause, such as Owen's clause, which embeds contract-specific carbon targets as a proportion of a company's corporate net zero target, and enforces it with a suite of mechanisms such as termination and offset payments for failure. If you want high ambition contract clauses to deliver your high ambition net zero target, then you need to be looking at the best-in-class net zero clauses. Our best-in-class clauses are clauses that have been updated to reflect the highest ambition of our net zero dashboard. This doesn't mean they are a revised version. It means that the original clauses are now the light green or lower ambition version of the clauses, and the best-in-class are the dark green or higher ambition versions. This is all about providing organisations with choice and capability to start from where they are, but move steadily across that dashboard until they're in the high ambition column. And you will all know that calibrating advice and contracting to the capability of an organisation is key. Putting in place hard, high ambition targets for a company which is not ready will not make them ready. They will fail to comply, and the GHG emissions will not be removed. Our net zero drafting checklist provides you with a framework to use when drafting or negotiating net zero concepts in contracts, or aligning drafting like our best-in-class clauses. You can find it on our website with our net zero implementation tools. The checklist cross-references to the Race to Zero criteria of starting line, pledge, plan, proceed, and publish, and leadership practices, scope, sinks and credits, and empowerment and equity. If you're planning to attend the Applying Net Zero to Contract Clauses workshop, we request that you review this checklist first, as this will be the framework for the collaborative exercise we will undertake. You may have seen that the Law Society of England and Wales has urged lawyers to develop a climate-conscious approach to legal practice. Having heard today about the urgency in finding climate solutions and with more understanding of net zero, how will you start using clauses today to play your part in reducing emissions and facilitating the transition to net zero? Using our clauses is not so hard. In the final part of this session, we will be discussing how you can continue to implement net zero in your contracts and to amplify your impact with TCLP clauses. Here are some suggestions for next steps. Apply your learning from today to your own practice to make your own contracts net zero aligned by using the checklist with climate clauses and sample wording from our website to implement into your daily drafting for clients or into your precedents. Share it with your colleagues, starting climate-conscious conversations about net zero and the Chancery Lane project. Or could you host your own climate contracting or net zero events, running this workshop for a group of your clients, colleagues, or contacts? I will shortly provide you details of our facilitator training. You can also learn more about TCLP and climate clauses by attending any of our events and also our one-to-one clinics, and making sure you are signed up to our newsletter to stay on top of new clauses, tools, and events from TCLP. So visit our events webpage to sign up for part 2 of this workshop, where you can apply what you learned today to a contractual clause. You can also get tailored support from a member of the TCLP team by signing up to attend a one-to-one clinic. Our Using Climate Clauses workshop provide an opportunity to get tips from others and find out what they are doing with the clauses. And facilitator training gives you the materials and support to be able to run your own climate clause or net zero workshop. Please do also get in touch with any questions. We would be grateful if you could provide feedback on this workshop through our event survey. The link is here at the bottom of the slide and also provided where you access this video. I'll also leave you to consider these final thoughts. What has most surprised or inspired you from what you have heard today? And what will your net zero action steps be in the next month or two? Thank you for your time.